There is a creature standing at the edge of a river. It is not impressive, not by any standard that the world it lives in would recognize as impressive. It is roughly the size of a large pig, low to the ground, moving with the unhurried deliberateness of an animal that has no reason to hurry. Its face is blunt and broad, its legs short, its body barrel-shaped in a way that suggests something built for endurance rather than speed. It has a pair of small tusks that it uses to dig up roots and pull at the tough vegetation growing along the riverbank. It does not hunt. It is not hunted, at this particular moment, by anything. It is simply here, at the edge of this river, on this morning, doing what it does every morning. This is Lystrosaurus, and it is one of the most ordinary creatures on a planet full of far more extraordinary things. That ordinariness is the first thing to hold on to, because almost everything more extraordinary than Lystrosaurus is going to disappear. The great predators that move through the forests beyond this river, the vast reef systems that have been growing in the ocean for hundreds of millions of years, the ancient marine animals that have survived every catastrophe this planet has thrown at life since before complex animals had eyes. The entire interlocking architecture of a world that took nearly 400 million years to build into the particular form it has reached on this morning. Almost all of it is going to be gone. Not today. Not in a single moment that anything alive will be able to point to as the beginning of the end. What is coming will unfold across timescales that dwarf everything the human mind reaches for when it tries to imagine deep time. Tens of thousands of years by some measures, millions of years by others. A catastrophe so large that its edges blur into geological time, so sustained that no single generation of any living thing will experience it as a crisis with a beginning and an end. Each generation will simply inherit a world that is a little worse than the one its parents knew, in ways that accumulate towards something that no living thing in this world can see coming. But it is coming. What is coming is the deadliest extinction event in the history of complex life on this planet. Not the one you have heard of. Not the event that ended the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. That one, catastrophic as it was, killed something in the range of 3/4 of all species on Earth. Devastating by any reasonable measure, and yet survivable, in the sense that enough of the tree of life remained intact afterward to rebuild what was lost within tens of millions of years. What is coming for the world that Lystrosaurus inhabits is different in kind. It will reach deeper into the tree of life than anything before or since. It will not spare the margins. It will not leave the ocean intact while it destroys the land, or leave the land intact while it works on the ocean. It will work on both simultaneously, through mechanisms that reinforce each other, through a cascade of consequences that turns each disaster into the cause of the next one. When it is done, the estimates of what was lost will be staggering. Among creatures living in the sea, the vast majority of species will be gone. Among animals living on land, the losses will be nearly as severe. The ocean will be chemically transformed. The land will be stripped of most of its biological complexity. The world that emerges on the other side will be so different from the world that exists on this morning that a traveler moving from one to the other, if such a thing were possible, would struggle to recognize them as the same planet. This is the Great Dying, the event that scientists formally call the end Permian mass extinction, that occurred 252 million years ago, that sits in the geological record as a boundary between two worlds so different from each other that geologists named the periods on either side of it after that difference. The world before, the world after, and standing at the edge of a river somewhere in the middle of what will one day be called the Southern Hemisphere, On a morning that looks like every other morning and feels like every other morning and gives no sign of being anything other than what it appears to be, is Lustrosaurus. It is one of the clearest witnesses we have from both sides of that boundary. We know it was here before, because its fossils appear in the rock layers of the late Permian. We know it was here after, because its fossils appear in the rock layers of the early Triassic, in numbers and across a geographic range that tell a specific and remarkable story that we will return to. The question at the center of everything that follows is not simply what happened to this world. The question is this: how did the Earth become so hostile that almost everything died? And what allowed the few lineages that did survive to make it through to the other side? That is the question Lystrosaurus answers. Not in words, but in bonds, in the specific, documentable fact of its presence on both sides of the worst boundary in the history of complex life, in what its survival tells us about what survival required. Everything else in this story is built around that question. The world that existed before the cascade began, the mechanisms by which the cascade unfolded, each one feeding the next, each one closing off options that had seemed permanent, the silence that followed, and the thread, thin and unlikely and never guaranteed, that ran through the silence and came out the other side, carrying something forward. Lystrosaurus is still at the river. The morning is still ordinary. The world is still intact, for now. To understand the scale of what the Great Dying destroyed, you have to first understand what existed before it. Not as a list of extinct species in a scientific paper, not as a collection of fossil names that mean nothing until you know what they were. As a world, a functioning, layered, extraordinarily complex world that had been building itself into its late Permian form for hundreds of millions of years and had, by the time this story begins, reached something close to its peak. The time is approximately 260 million years ago. In the later stages of the Permian period, the Earth looks nothing like the planet you know. Start with the geography, because the geography shapes everything else. Every major landmass on Earth is joined together into a single supercontinent. Geologists call it Pangaea, from the Greek for all Earth, and the name is accurate in a way that is difficult to fully visualize. Everything that will one day become North America is connected to everything that will one day become Europe. Everything that will one day become Africa is connected to what will become South America, to what will become Antarctica, to what will become India and Australia. There is no Atlantic Ocean. There is no Indian Ocean. There is one enormous piece of land, asymmetrically shaped, surrounded by one enormous ocean that covers the rest of the planet. This geography has consequences that run through everything about the late Permian world. It means that land animals can, in principle, walk from what will one day be the Arctic to what will one day be the southern tip of Africa without crossing open water. It means that species can spread across a connected landmass in ways that will become impossible once the continents begin to drift apart. It means that the biological communities of the late Permian land are not isolated from each other by ocean barriers. They are part of one world, in the most literal geographical sense. And that world is thriving. On land, the dominant animals are a group called synapsids. The name is technical, but the group it describes is one of the most important in the history of life, because synapsids are the lineage that will eventually, through a long and complicated evolutionary journey that the Great Dying will directly shape, produce mammals. In the late Permian, that journey has not yet been completed. What exists instead are older, stranger animals that fill the ecological roles that mammals will later occupy, filling them with the efficiency of creatures that have had millions of years to perfect their approaches. Among the plant eaters, there are the dicynodonts, stocky, often large, equipped with a pair of tusks and a beak-like mouth adapted for processing tough vegetation. They move through the Permian landscape in numbers that suggest genuine ecological dominance. They range from small burrowing forms to animals the size of modern cattle. They are, in function, if not in form, the equivalents of the large herbivores that define the great ecosystems of the modern world. Above them, in the food chain, are the gorgonopsids. If you want to understand what the late Permian world felt like at its highest level of biological complexity, the gorgonopsids are where to look. They are large, with the biggest species reaching the size of a modern rhinoceros. They move on, limbs positioned more efficiently beneath their bodies than the earlier reptilian posture allowed, giving them a gait that more closely resembles a modern predator than the sprawling locomotion of a lizard. Their skulls are built around their teeth, specifically around a pair of elongated canines that project well below the jawline, designed with the specificity of something that has been doing one job for a very long time and has been refined by millions of years of selection to do that job as well as it can be done. They are the apex predators of their world, not a prototype of an apex predator, not an early draft of something that will later become more sophisticated, the finished product of an evolutionary lineage that has been producing predators since before the Permian began, reaching in the late Permian the most refined version of itself that it will ever achieve. In the ocean, the situation is equally extraordinary. The Permian seas are full in the way that only ancient, undisturbed ocean systems can be full. Reef systems built from organisms called rugose and tabulate corals have been growing for millions of years, creating three-dimensional habitat structures that support hundreds of species dependent on their complexity. On the seafloor, crinoids extend their feathery arms into the current to filter food from the water, covering large areas of the bottom in what researchers have described as underwater meadows of waving, flower-like animals, brachiopods, which superficially resemble clams but represent an entirely separate branch of the animal family tree, are among the most abundant invertebrates in the ocean, present in extraordinary diversity and numbers. These groups have earned their success over timescales that are difficult to hold in the mind. Some of them have been present in the ocean for hundreds of millions of years before the late Permian. They are not experiments. They are established, proven, successful ways of being alive in the sea, refined across geological time into forms that work with extraordinary efficiency in the conditions the Permian Ocean provides. It is the kind of world that, if you could observe it without knowing what comes next, would seem permanent, stable, in the way that only very old things seem stable, as if the complexity and the interconnection and the sheer accumulated time of it all had made it durable beyond ordinary challenge. It had not. Nothing biological is durable beyond the conditions that produced it. That is the lesson the Great Dying teaches more completely than any other event in the history of this planet. But on this morning, in this world, that lesson has not yet been delivered. The ocean is full. The land is thriving. The gorgonopsids are hunting. Lystrosaurus is at the river. And far to the north, beneath the surface of the land that will one day be Siberia, something is beginning. There is no announcement. That is the first thing to understand about what begins in the north, beneath the surface of the late Permian world, sometime in the final few million years before the boundary. There is no event that any living thing can perceive as the beginning of anything. No sound that travels across the supercontinent and registers in the nervous systems of the animals going about their lives in the forests and along the rivers and in the depths of the ocean. No change in the quality of the air or the temperature of the water or the chemistry of the soil that anything alive has the biological equipment to detect as a signal of danger. What is beginning is a geological process, and geological processes do not announce themselves to the organisms that happen to be alive when they begin. They simply begin beneath the surface of what will one day be Siberia. In the region, geologists will eventually call the Siberian traps. The mantle of the Earth is moving. Hot material from deep within the planet is rising toward the surface, following pathways of weakness in the overlying rock. This is not unusual in a general sense. The mantle has been moving throughout the history of the Earth, driving the slow rearrangement of continents, powering the volcanic activity that has always been part of the planet's surface expression. What makes what is beginning in Siberia different is the scale at which it is about to operate. The hot material rising through the Siberian crust is approaching a region where the lithosphere is thin and where the rock layers through which the magma will eventually pass are chemically rich in ways that will matter enormously. Coal beds, carbonate rocks, evaporite deposits, layers of sedimentary rock that have been accumulating and storing their chemical contents for hundreds of millions of years. When the magma reaches these layers and heats them, they will not simply be displaced. They will react. They will release the chemistry they have been storing into whatever pathway is available. And the pathway that is available is upward, into the magma, into the eruptions, into the atmosphere. None of this is happening yet at the surface. It is happening below, in the deep time of rock and heat and pressure, in processes that operate on timescales measured in hundreds of thousands of years, rather than the seasons and generations that biological time is measured in. But it is happening, and the world above it, in all its extraordinary complexity and apparent permanence, has no mechanism for knowing. The gorgonopsids are still hunting in the forests of the southern supercontinent, thousands of kilometers from Siberia. The crinoids are still waving in the Permian current. The trilobites, whose lineage stretches back more than 500 million years, are still moving across the ocean floor as they have done since before complex animals developed eyes. Lystrosaurus is still at the river, still doing what it does every morning, its nervous system registering nothing beyond the immediate sensory world of food and light and the sounds of a living landscape. The world is complete. The world is functioning. The world has no idea. There is something important in that ignorance, and it is worth pausing on before the cascade begins. The organisms of the late Permian did not fail to prepare for what was coming because they were not intelligent enough, or not complex enough, or not sufficiently evolved. They failed to prepare because there was nothing in the history of life up to that point that had equipped any organism with the ability to detect and respond to a threat operating at the scale and through the mechanisms that the Siberian traps were about to deploy. Evolution produces responses to pressures that have been encountered before, or that resemble pressures that have been encountered before, closely enough that existing responses can be adapted. It does not produce responses to things that have not happened in any form that the history of any living lineage includes. The late Permian world had never experienced what was about to happen to it, not in any form that any lineage alive in it could have learned from. What was coming was genuinely new, new in scale, new in mechanism, new in the combination of ways it would attack the conditions that complex life depends on simultaneously and from multiple directions at once. The forests do not know. The ocean does not know. The great predators moving through the trees do not know, even Lustrosaurus, the animal that will turn out to have exactly the combination of characteristics needed to survive what none of them can see coming, does not know. It is standing at the edge of a river. The morning light is on the water, and beneath the surface of the world, the first pressure is building toward the moment when it will find its way out. When it does, nothing will be the same again. The first thing to understand about the Siberian traps is the thing that the word volcano almost always gets wrong. When most people hear the word volcano, a specific image forms: a mountain, a cone shape rising above a landscape, an eruption that is violent and dramatic and visible from great distances, a column of ash and fire that reaches into the sky and then, eventually, stops. The mountain quiets, the ash settles, the lava flow cools into new rock. The immediate area around the volcano is devastated, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. But the devastation is local. The rest of the world, beyond some temporary effects on sunlight and temperature from the ash in the upper atmosphere, continues. The Siberian traps are not that. There is no mountain. There is no cone. What the Siberian traps represent is something the geological vocabulary struggles to make vivid to a non-specialist audience, which is part of why the scale of what happened there is so consistently underestimated by people encountering the Great Dying for the first time. It is not a volcanic eruption in the way that word functions in the human imagination. It is a rupture, a vast, spreading system of fissures in the crust of the earth, distributed across an area that will eventually cover approximately 2 million square kilometers, through which magma does not so much explode as pour, continuously, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, for a period that geological estimates place at somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million years, and possibly longer. Try to hold that duration for a moment, not as a number, as a reality. 1 million years of continuous eruption. The total volume of material that the Siberian traps ultimately produce is staggering by any human scale of measurement. Estimates suggest enough lava to bury the entire surface of the continental United States under a layer several kilometers deep. That number is almost impossible to make viscerally real, which is why the lava itself is not actually the most important part of the story. Lava destroys what it covers. It is devastating locally, but it stays where it lands. It cools. It becomes rock. The ecosystem immediately around it is destroyed, but the atmosphere above it, and the ocean chemistry beyond it, and the climate of the planet as a whole are not transformed by lava. They are transformed by what comes up with the lava. Every time magma rises through the Earth's crust, it passes through whatever rock layers lie between its source and the surface. Most of the time, those rock layers are relatively unremarkable from a chemical standpoint. In Siberia, they are not. The crust beneath the Siberian traps contains an unusual concentration of coal beds, carbonate rocks, and evaporite deposits. These are sedimentary layers that have been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years, storing carbon and sulfur in solid form within the rock. When the rising magma heats these layers, it does not simply melt them. It cooks them. It drives off the gases they contain, and those gases have nowhere to go but up, into the magma, through the eruptions, into the atmosphere. The sulfur dioxide arrives in the atmosphere with a speed and volume that the atmosphere of the late Permian has no mechanism to buffer. Sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere combines with water vapor, The product of that combination is sulfuric acid. And sulfuric acid, distributed through the atmosphere and carried down by precipitation, is what produces acid rain, not the mild, technically elevated acidity rain that the phrase has come to mean in contemporary environmental discussions. Genuine acid precipitation, sustained across years and decades, falling on forests and soils and freshwater systems that evolved in a world where rain was simply water. The effects on terrestrial ecosystems begin to accumulate. Plant tissue damaged by repeated acid exposure loses efficiency. Soil chemistry begins to shift in ways that reduce the availability of nutrients that plants depend on. Freshwater systems, receiving the same acid inputs, begin to change in ways that affect the organisms living in them. These are not sudden, visible catastrophes. They are the kind of slow degradation that does not announce itself as a crisis, because no single day is dramatically different from the one before it. But across years and decades, the cumulative damage builds. The carbon dioxide is a different problem, operating on a different time scale, and it is ultimately the larger one. The Siberian traps, across the full duration of their activity, release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a rate that has few, if any, parallels in the geological record of the past several hundred million years. The mechanism by which carbon dioxide affects global temperature is not complicated in its basic form. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere absorbs heat that would otherwise escape into space and radiates it back toward the surface. More carbon dioxide means more heat retained. More heat retained means higher global temperatures. The complication is not in the mechanism. It is in the scale and the speed. Global temperatures during the lead-up to the Permian-Triassic boundary begin to rise. The estimates from geochemical proxies in the rock record suggest a warming of somewhere between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius above baseline over the course of the crisis. Though the precise numbers are debated, and the warming was not uniform across the planet, what is not debated is the direction. The world is getting hotter, significantly hotter, and it is getting hotter faster than evolutionary adaptation can track. For the land ecosystems, the combination of acid damage and rising temperatures begins to operate together in ways that neither alone would produce. Heat and moisture stress on already acid-damaged plants accelerate the decline of forest systems that were the foundation of terrestrial food webs. Insects, whose ecological relationships with plant systems had been developing across hundreds of millions of years of Permian and pre-Permian history, begin to decline as the plant communities they depend on come under sustained pressure. The rearrangement of ecological relationships across the terrestrial landscape is not dramatic and sudden. It is persistent and cumulative and moving in one direction. Through all of this, Lystrosaurus is still alive, still moving through a landscape that is changing in ways too large and too slow for any nervous system to register as immediate danger. The changes it is experiencing are the kind that accumulate below the threshold of perception. Each day is survivable. Each season is difficult in ways that the previous season was also difficult. The world is not visibly ending. It is quietly, persistently, becoming less. The gorgonopsids are still alive too, still hunting, still the apex predators of a food web that is, beneath the surface of its day-to-day functioning, beginning to lose the lower levels that everything above depends on. They do not know what is happening. Nothing in this world does. And above them all, in the atmosphere that connects Siberia to every corner of the planet, the carbon dioxide continues to accumulate. The heat continues to build. And the ocean, which has always been connected to the atmosphere above it, and which has always absorbed a portion of whatever the atmosphere contains, is about to discover what that connection means, when what the atmosphere contains is something the ocean has not encountered in this concentration in a very long time. The fires in Siberia are still burning. They will not stop for a very long time, and the cascade that they have set in motion has only just begun to reach the water. The ocean and the atmosphere are not separate systems. This is a fact so fundamental to how the Earth works that it shapes everything about what happens next. And yet, it is easy to lose sight of when thinking about a catastrophe that is often described primarily in terms of volcanic eruptions and atmospheric chemistry. The ocean covers more than 70% of the planet's surface. It is in continuous chemical exchange with the atmosphere above it. Whatever accumulates in the atmosphere does not stay only in the atmosphere. It moves, in the quantities that physics and chemistry allow, into the water. Carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater. This is not a new process, and it is not, under normal conditions, a harmful one. The ocean has been absorbing carbon dioxide for as long as the atmosphere has contained it. Under the conditions that prevailed throughout most of the Permian, the rate of absorption was slow enough, and the ocean's buffering chemistry robust enough, that the process was essentially invisible in its effects on the organisms living in the water. The ocean absorbed what it absorbed. Its chemistry adjusted gradually, and the life in it had time, measured in the generations of organisms that lived and evolved and adapted, to accommodate whatever slow changes resulted. The conditions of the latest Permian are not those conditions. The rate at which the Siberian traps are injecting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is far beyond what the ocean's buffering chemistry can comfortably handle. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it reacts to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid dissociates, releasing hydrogen ions. More hydrogen ions in the water means lower pH. Lower pH means, in the language that matters for organisms, a more acidic ocean. Researchers studying the geochemistry of the Permian-Triassic boundary continue to work through the details of exactly how rapidly this acidification occurred, how uniformly it was distributed across different ocean basins, and precisely which organisms were most directly affected by it, and through what mechanisms. The science is active, and the answers are not fully resolved. What the evidence does consistently show is that the ocean chemistry at the boundary changes in ways that are measurable across multiple geochemical proxies, that those changes are consistent with significant acidification in at least some regions and periods, and that the organisms most vulnerable to changing ocean chemistry are among the hardest hit during the Great Dying. Those organisms are the ones that build their bodies from calcium carbonate, shells, external skeletons, the structural material of reef systems. In water that is becoming more acidic, calcium carbonate dissolves more readily and requires more energy to produce. For organisms that have evolved over millions of years in an ocean with a particular chemistry, the energy budget of building and maintaining calcium carbonate structures shifts in the wrong direction. The ocean is not simply becoming inhospitable in a general way. It is becoming, specifically, mechanistically hostile to the particular biological strategies that the most successful marine organisms of the Permian have built their existence around. The reef systems are the most visible expression of this. The rugose and tabulate corals that have been building the framework of Permian reef ecosystems for millions of years are among the animals most dependent on stable ocean chemistry for their calcification processes. As the chemistry shifts, their ability to build and maintain reef structure declines. The reefs do not disappear overnight. The process is not uniform across all ocean environments simultaneously, but the direction is consistent. And what a reef losing its structural integrity means for the hundreds of species that depend on the habitat it provides is not subtle. Remove the architecture and the community built around it begins to unravel. Brachiopods, which have been among the most successful marine invertebrates on Earth for over 400 million years by the time of the Permian crisis, experience a collapse in diversity and abundance that the fossil record captures with striking clarity. Crinoids, those underwater forests of filter feeders that covered large areas of the Permian seafloor, retreat. Ammonites, the coiled cephalopods that navigated the Permian Ocean in extraordinary variety, suffer losses that reduce their diversity dramatically. Group after group, each one representing hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history, each one occupying ecological roles that the ocean has organized itself around, comes under pressure that its biology has no evolved response to. And the ocean is warming. The connection between atmospheric carbon dioxide and ocean temperature is the same connection that is warming the atmosphere. The ocean absorbs heat from the atmosphere above it. As the atmosphere warms, the ocean warms. And ocean warming carries its own consequences that operate alongside the acidification, reinforcing it in some cases and adding entirely new stresses in others. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. This is basic physics, the kind that does not negotiate with the complexity of the ecosystem it is affecting. As ocean surface temperatures rise, the amount of oxygen dissolved in the upper ocean begins to decline. This matters directly for every organism in the ocean that requires oxygen to metabolize, which is to say, virtually every complex animal in it. But the more consequential effect of ocean warming on oxygenation operates through a different mechanism, one that reaches deeper into the ocean than the surface warming itself. Cold water is denser than warm water. In a normally functioning ocean, cold, oxygen-rich water forming at the surface in high latitudes sinks and spreads slowly across the deep ocean floor, ventilating the depths with oxygen that photosynthesis at the surface produces. This circulation is one of the fundamental processes that makes the deep ocean habitable for complex life. It is driven by the temperature difference between the cold, polar surface waters and the warmer waters elsewhere. As global temperatures rise, that temperature difference begins to decrease. The density contrast that drives the circulation weakens. The circulation slows. The deep ocean receives less oxygen from the surface. In the regions where this process is most advanced, the deep water begins to stagnate. Oxygen levels in the depths fall, and as they fall, the ecology of what can live there changes in ways that will have consequences reaching far beyond the deep ocean floor. The organisms that can adjust are doing so. Some fish lineages, equipped with the flexibility to shift their diets as their preferred food sources decline, and to move through the water column in search of conditions that remain survivable, are losing species and losing abundance, but retaining a foothold. They are not thriving. Thriving is no longer available. But they are present on both sides of the boundary, in sufficient continuity to carry something forward. Most things do not have that flexibility. Most of the Permian Ocean's inhabitants have spent their evolutionary history optimizing for conditions that are now changing faster than optimization can track. The reef builders, the filter feeders, the organisms whose bodies are made of the material that the changing ocean chemistry is specifically targeting, are discovering what it means to be perfectly adapted to a world that is ceasing to exist. The ocean of the late Permian, the ancient, layered, extraordinarily diverse system that took hundreds of millions of years to build into its peak Permian form, is being disassembled, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic moment, but persistently, relentlessly, in the direction of something simpler and less hospitable, and less capable of sustaining the complexity of life that filled it on that ordinary morning when Lystrosaurus was standing at the river, and none of this had yet become visible. The sulfur dioxide is still falling as acid. The carbon dioxide is still accumulating. The temperatures are still rising. And in the deepest parts of the ocean, in the zones that the circulation is no longer adequately ventilating, something else is beginning to happen. Something that will add another layer to a cascade that is already operating through more mechanisms simultaneously than any previous extinction event in Earth's history had managed. The oxygen is leaving the deep water. And in the space that it leaves behind, something is growing. There is a word that appears in the scientific literature on the Great Dying with a frequency that reflects how central the process it describes is to understanding what happened in the ocean during the end Permian crisis. The word is anoxia. It comes from the Greek an, meaning without, oxys, meaning oxygen. Anoxia is the condition of being without oxygen, not low in oxygen, not depleted of oxygen to levels that stress complex life. Without oxygen, the complete or near complete removal of dissolved oxygen from a body of water, leaving behind conditions that the vast majority of complex animals cannot survive in for any meaningful period of time. Anoxia is not new to the ocean. Localized zones of low or absent oxygen have existed throughout the history of the Earth, wherever the combination of poor circulation, high organic input, and bacterial decomposition have created the conditions for it. In the modern ocean, oxygen minimum zones exist at certain depths in certain regions, and the organisms living near them have evolved responses to the gradients at their edges. Anoxia as a local, contained phenomenon is something the ocean knows how to accommodate. What develops in the ocean of the latest Permian is not local. It is not contained, and the ocean, and everything living in it, has never encountered it at the scale at which it arrives. The mechanism begins with the warming that the previous chapter described, but it does not end there. As the ocean warms, two reinforcing processes operate simultaneously to reduce the oxygen content of the water column. The first is direct. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen than cooler water. This is a physical property of water that does not change, regardless of how much evolutionary history is depending on it remaining otherwise. As surface temperatures rise, the oxygen concentration of the upper ocean declines. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but measurably and persistently. The second process is the one with the deeper consequences. As the temperature difference between polar surface waters and the rest of the ocean decreases, the density-driven circulation that ventilates the deep ocean with oxygen from the surface weakens. The cold, heavy, oxygen-rich water that normally sinks at high latitudes and spreads across the ocean floor in a slow conveyor of oxygenation slows down. In some regions, it may nearly stop. The deep ocean, which receives all of its oxygen from this circulation because photosynthesis cannot occur below the depth that sunlight reaches, begins to suffocate. In the sediment record, at the Permian-Triassic boundary, the geochemical signatures of this process are preserved with a clarity that makes the reconstruction of what happened possible, even 252 million years later. The presence of certain iron compounds that only form in the absence of oxygen, the isotopic signatures of sulfur that record the activity of the specific bacteria that thrive when oxygen is gone, the absence of the bioturbation, the mixing of sediments by burrowing animals. That indicates a seafloor where complex animals can no longer live. These proxies tell a consistent story across multiple locations and ocean basins. The deep ocean is losing its oxygen. The anoxic zones are expanding, and they are expanding from the bottom up, pushing the boundary between survivable and unsurvivable water higher and higher in the water column. For the animals compressed into the shrinking oxygenated zone near the surface, the crisis is compounding. They are already dealing with changing chemistry that is dissolving the structures their bodies depend on. They are already dealing with temperatures pushing past the ranges their physiology was built for. And now the vertical space in the ocean where the conditions for complex life still exist is contracting from below. In the water that the oxygen has abandoned, a different ecology takes over. Bacteria that can function without oxygen, what biologists call anaerobic bacteria, are not new to the ocean. They have always existed in the localized anoxic zones that occur naturally. But as those zones expand dramatically, the anaerobic bacteria expand with them. And anaerobic bacteria, breaking down the organic matter that rains down from the dying ecosystems above, produce waste products that aerobic decomposition does not. One of those waste products is hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic to most complex life. At low concentrations, it is identifiable by its smell, the sharp, unmistakable odor of rotten eggs. At higher concentrations, it is lethal to vertebrates and most invertebrates within minutes. It interferes with the cellular machinery that uses oxygen to produce energy, effectively poisoning the process of aerobic respiration at the molecular level. An animal exposed to high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide does not have the option of adapting. It simply dies. In the expanding anoxic zones of the late Permian Ocean, hydrogen sulfide is accumulating in concentrations that the geological record preserves in its geochemical signatures. The deep ocean is not merely uninhabitable for complex life because the oxygen is gone. It is actively toxic, filled with a gas that kills the kind of life that the Permian Ocean spent hundreds of millions of years producing. And then there is the question of what happens when the hydrogen sulfide does not stay in the deep water. This is where the science becomes its most unsettled and its most significant. Some researchers, examining the geochemical record at the Permian-Triassic boundary, have found evidence consistent with the hypothesis that hydrogen sulfide, accumulating in sufficient concentration in the deep ocean and in shallow shelf environments, may have periodically escaped into the atmosphere in certain regions. The chemistry of the boundary rock in some locations shows signatures that have been interpreted as evidence of hydrogen sulfide reaching the upper ocean and the air above it. The hypothesis is not universally accepted. The debate in the scientific literature is genuine and ongoing, and the evidence is interpreted differently by different research groups examining different locations. But consider what the hypothesis implies, if it is even partially correct. The ocean and the atmosphere have been exchanging gases throughout this entire crisis. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere has been entering the ocean, changing its chemistry. Now, in the regions where the anoxic zones have expanded to the point where hydrogen sulfide is reaching the surface, the exchange may be running in the other direction. A gas that is toxic to most complex animal life is moving from the ocean into the air that the land ecosystems breathe. The land and the ocean have been experiencing the same crisis through different mechanisms: acid rain and rising temperatures on land, acidification and deoxygenation in the ocean. If hydrogen sulfide is reaching the atmosphere, even regionally, even intermittently. The crisis is no longer two parallel catastrophes affecting two different environments. It becomes one catastrophe, atmospheric in its reach, affecting everything that breathes. In the ocean, during this period, one group experiences the full convergence of everything. The crisis is deploying more completely than almost any other. Trilobites. If you wanted to identify an animal that represents the success and the durability of complex life in the ocean before the Great Dying, trilobites are the answer. Their fossil record extends back more than 520 million years to the early Cambrian, to a time when the animal kingdom was still inventing most of its basic body plans. They survived the end Ordovician mass extinction, which eliminated the majority of marine species living at the time. They survived the late Devonian extinction events, which reshaped ocean ecosystems profoundly. They survived the end Guadalupian extinction, a significant event in the Middle Permian that serves as a kind of preview of the catastrophe still to come. Each time, the trilobite lineage was reduced but not eliminated. Each time, it recovered and continued. They have been in the ocean for longer than the interval between now and the first dinosaurs. Multiplied by more than 10, they will not survive the Great Dying. Not one lineage, not one species, the entire group, the full diversity of an animal phylum that spent over 270 million years figuring out how to be alive in the ocean, is gone at the Permian-Triassic boundary, gone completely, without a single survivor to carry the experiment forward into the Triassic. An evolutionary history longer than the entire subsequent history of vertebrates on land ended. What the trilobites encountered at the end of the Permian was the convergence of every stressor the crisis deployed simultaneously, changing ocean chemistry, attacking their calcium carbonate exoskeletons, rising temperatures, pushing past the ranges their physiology could handle, expanding anoxic zones, eliminating the seafloor habitats where many species lived and fed, and possibly in the shallow shelf environments where many of the remaining trilobite populations were concentrated. The intrusion of hydrogen sulfide into waters that had previously been survivable. Any one of these stressors might have been survivable. Trilobites had survived severe stressors before. The combination, operating simultaneously and continuously and without any period of recovery, was something different. When the last trilobite dies, somewhere in the shallow seas of the latest Permian or the earliest Triassic, the longest continuous run of any complex animal group in the history of the ocean comes to an end without ceremony. There is no record of it in the rock beyond its absence. The fossils that were present in the layers below are simply not present in the layers above. Absence is the loudest thing the rock record says during the Great Dying, and the ocean has not yet finished producing it. While the ocean is losing itself to chemistry and heat and the spreading silence of anoxia, the land is undergoing a different kind of unraveling. And the two catastrophes, the one in the water and the one on the land, are not simply occurring in parallel. They are connected. They are feeding each other. The same atmospheric changes driving the ocean crisis are driving the terrestrial one. And the collapse of terrestrial ecosystems creates feedback effects that deepen the ocean crisis. In turn, on land, the accumulated effects of what the Siberian traps have been doing to the atmosphere are beginning to compound into something that no single mechanism alone would have produced. Temperatures across the land surface of Pangaea are rising. The interior of the supercontinent, already arid because of its distance from ocean moisture, is becoming more arid still as precipitation patterns shift under the altered atmospheric circulation of a hotter world. Regions that supported forest ecosystems under the climatic conditions of the mid-Permian are receiving less rainfall. The forests are coming under moisture stress that adds to the acid damage they have been accumulating from years of altered precipitation chemistry. The forests of the late Permian are not the forests of the modern world. They are dominated by different plant groups, gymnosperms and seed ferns and tree-like plants, where modern relatives exist at all, are mostly minor components of contemporary ecosystems rather than dominant ones. But they are forests in every functional sense. They produce oxygen. They hold soil with their root systems. They cycle water through transpiration. They provide habitat for the animal communities living in and among them. They are the biological infrastructure of the terrestrial world, the foundation on which everything else that lives on land depends. As they come under compound stress from heat and moisture deficit and altered soil chemistry, that infrastructure begins to fail. The relationship between insects and terrestrial plant systems in the late Permian has been developing across hundreds of millions of years. It is not the same relationship that defines the modern world, where flowering plants and the insects that pollinate them have co-evolved into one of the most interdependent partnerships in the history of life. Flowering plants do not yet exist in the Permian, but insects and plants have been living in ecological relationship with each other since long before the Permian began, sharing habitat, depending on each other through relationships of herbivory and decomposition, and the complex trophic interactions that tie animal communities to plant communities. As the plants come under stress and decline, the insects decline with them. And as the insects decline, the ecological services they provide across the terrestrial landscape, decomposition, nutrient cycling, the movement of energy through food webs, begin to diminish. The terrestrial food web is losing its lower levels, and without its lower levels, everything above it is operating on a budget that is shrinking. In the geological record, this process leaves behind one of the most striking and least discussed signatures of the Great Dying. Geologists call it the coal gap. Coal forms from the accumulated remains of land plants, compressed and chemically transformed over millions of years under the right depositional conditions. It requires a sustained, abundant supply of plant material dying and accumulating in waterlogged environments where decomposition is slow enough that organic matter can build up rather than being consumed. Throughout the Carboniferous and Permian, coal-forming environments were widespread, and the rock record reflects this in the coal deposits that accumulated across many parts of Pangaea over hundreds of millions of years. At the Permian-Triassic boundary, coal deposition essentially stops. Not everywhere, simultaneously, and not without some regional variation. But the pattern is consistent enough across enough locations that it is recognized as a genuine global signal in the rock record. For millions of years after the boundary, coal is nearly absent from the sedimentary sequence. The gap is not a quirk of preservation. It is not an artifact of the way geologists sample the record. It is the geological expression of a biological reality. The plant communities that produced coal-forming deposits have collapsed to the point where they can no longer produce them. The forests are gone, or reduced to a fraction of what they were. Across the terrestrial landscape of the earliest Triassic, what replaces them is documented in the sediment record with a clarity that the absence of coal makes more visible. River systems that were stable and meandering under the conditions of a vegetated Permian landscape become unstable and braided in the earliest Triassic. Braided river systems are the signature of landscapes where vegetation is insufficient to stabilize banks and channels. where erosion is running faster than plant systems can keep pace with. The land, stripped of much of its biological cover, is washing into the waterways in volumes that the river systems of the late Permian, shaped by millions of years of stable vegetated conditions, were never configured to handle. The gorgonopsids are dying through all of this. Not suddenly, not in a single season or a single year. But the food web that sustains apex predators of their size and metabolic demands requires a functional base. And the base is failing. The dicynodont herds that the gorgonopsids hunt are themselves thinning as the plant communities they depend on retreat. A predator that requires large prey animals to sustain itself cannot persist when the population of large prey animals is collapsing. The gorgonopsids are, in this sense, the final expression of a cascade that started far below them in the food web and has been working its way upward. By the time the extinction is at its most severe, the gorgonopsids are gone. Every species, every lineage. The most sophisticated predators the synapsid lineage had yet produced, the apex of hundreds of millions of years of predator evolution, in that particular branch of the animal family tree, are absent from the fossil record above the boundary. They do not decline gradually into smaller, simpler forms. They end, and Lystrosaurus is still alive. Not comfortable, not thriving. The landscape it is moving through is not the landscape it was moving through at the beginning of this story. The forests are thinner. The rivers run differently. The animal communities around it are reduced in ways that would be apparent even to a nervous system not equipped to understand what reduction means at the scale of an ecosystem. The world is quieter than it was. Not silent yet, but quieter in the specific way that signals something has been lost that is not coming back. Lystrosaurus moves through this diminished world the same way it moved through the intact one, finding food where food exists, moving when conditions require movement, burrowing when the surface temperatures peak at levels that the open air cannot sustain, persisting through each day because persistence is what it does. Because nothing in its biology has a setting for stopping. It does not know it is one of the survivors. It does not know there is anything to survive. It knows the smell of water and the texture of roots and the particular quality of shade that means a temperature its body can manage. That is enough. For now, it is exactly enough. And above the land and the ocean both, the Siberian traps are still burning. The carbon dioxide is still accumulating. The temperatures are still climbing. And the cascade that began with a rupture in the crust of the earth, in a region that nothing alive had any reason to pay attention to, is approaching the moment that geologists will one day mark with a line in the rock and a name that captures, in 2 words, what that line represents. The Great Dying. The line is almost here. There is a layer of rock. It exists in outcrops and cliff faces and carefully extracted core samples in locations distributed across the surface of the planet. In the mountains of southern China, where some of the most studied sections of the boundary have been examined in detail by researchers spending careers on the question of what the rock remembers. In the canyon walls of the American West, where the sedimentary record of ancient seas preserves its chemistry in layers that patient analysis can read. In the hills of Italy, in the karst landscapes of Slovenia, in the exposed marine sequences of the Salt Range in what is now Pakistan, wherever the geological conditions were right to preserve a continuous record across the transition from the Permian to the Triassic, the rock is there. And in many of these places, the rock says the same thing. Below a certain line, the rock is full of life. Shell fragments and bone fragments and the compressed Mineralized remains of organisms that were present in extraordinary abundance and diversity. Trilobite pieces, brachiopod valves, the coiled geometry of ammonites, crinoid stem segments, the traces of burrowing animals that mixed the sediment as they moved through it, leaving behind the disturbed, churned texture that geologists call bioturbation, the signature of a seafloor where complex animals were actively living and moving. The rock below the line is busy in the way that healthy ecosystems are busy, full of the evidence of many things going about the work of being alive simultaneously. Above the line, the rock changes, not slowly, not gradually, in the way that a long decline might express itself across many meters of accumulated sediment. Abruptly, at the boundary itself, the character of the rock shifts. The fossil density drops. The bioturbation disappears, or nearly so. In some sections, there are layers of rock above the boundary that preserve almost no evidence of complex animal life at all. The seafloor sediments record a return to microbial dominance. The layered, finely laminated structures that form when bacteria are the primary organisms processing organic material at the sediment surface. Structures that had been characteristic of the pre-animal ocean, but that complex animals had largely replaced through hundreds of millions of years of bioturbation and ecosystem engineering. The bacteria are coming back, not because they evolved something new, because the complex animals that had been outcompeting them and overwriting their sedimentary signatures for hundreds of millions of years are no longer there in sufficient numbers to do so. The absence of bioturbation above the boundary is not the presence of something different. It is the presence of nothing, the presence of the simple things that persist when the complex things are gone. The numbers that researchers have assembled from the fossil record to describe what happened at the boundary are extraordinary by any standard of biological catastrophe. Among marine invertebrates, species-level estimates of extinction magnitude range across different studies and different groups. But the consistent finding is that the losses are severe across essentially every major group of marine animals. The dominant filter feeders of the Permian Ocean, the brachiopods and crinoids and bryozoans, lose the vast majority of their diversity. The reef-building organisms are effectively eliminated, and the reef systems they built do not return in comparable form for millions of years after the boundary. Among terrestrial vertebrates, the losses are similarly severe, with the majority of known species disappearing from the record at or near the boundary. These numbers are estimates. They are built from fossil records that are incomplete in ways that researchers continue to quantify and account for. The precise figures vary by study and by group and by location and by the methods used to calculate them. The debates about the exact magnitude of the losses at different taxonomic levels and in different environments are real and ongoing. What is not debated is the direction, and the direction is toward the most severe biological impoverishment of the Earth's surface that the geological record documents in the history of complex life. But numbers, even numbers of this magnitude, do not capture what was actually lost. And it is worth pausing here, at the bottom of the emotional arc of this story, to try to hold what the numbers represent in a way that the numbers themselves do not make easy. A species is not a unit. It is a node in a network. Every species that disappears from an ecosystem takes with it every relationship it was part of, the prey it consumed, the predators that consumed it, the parasites that depended on it as a host, the organisms whose decomposition it facilitated, the habitat modifications it made through its behavior and its physical presence, every mutualistic interaction it was part of, every competitive relationship it was embedded in. every indirect effect it had on other species through the chains of interaction that connect every node in a complex ecosystem to every other node. When you lose most of the nodes in a network, you do not lose most of the network. You lose most of the network many times over, because each lost node removes support from the connections that depended on it. And those lost connections remove support from other nodes that might otherwise have persisted. And the cascade of secondary effects from each primary loss extends in ways that the primary loss alone does not predict. Ecologists call this process a trophic cascade. In the Great Dying, it operates at a scale that the word cascade does not adequately convey. What emerges on the other side of the boundary is not the Permian world diminished. It is something different in kind, simpler, ecologically impoverished in ways that will take tens of millions of years to begin to recover from. The dominant organisms in the ocean are no longer the complex, interdependent communities of animals that built the Permian reef systems and filled the water column with layered diversity. They are bacteria, microbial mats, the kind of biological communities that characterized the ocean before animals existed, returning to dominance in the spaces that the animal communities have abandoned. The land is not better. The coal gap is opening. The forests are retreating. The river systems are destabilizing. The animal communities are reduced to a fraction of their former diversity, dominated by a small number of generalist survivors in a landscape that no longer has the biological complexity to support the specialists that defined the Permian. The world is in ruins, and in those ruins, almost invisible against the scale of what has been lost, are the things that are still alive. Not many things, not a diverse and thriving remnant of the former world, waiting for conditions to improve so that it can rebuild. A small number of lineages, in a small number of locations, surviving through combinations of characteristics and circumstances that the cascade did not eliminate. They are not abundant. Most of them, they are not healthy. Most of them, they are simply present, still metabolizing, still reproducing, however slowly and however precariously, still occupying the minimum definition of alive in a world that has done its best to make alive impossible. The question of why they are still there, and what allowed them to be still there when almost everything else is not, is the question that the silence poses. Not loudly. The silence does not pose questions loudly. It poses them in the way that empty rock poses questions. Through absence. Through the space where something was and is no longer. Through the particular quality of a world stripped down to its least removable elements and asking, without words, what those elements are and why they remained when everything else did not. In the ruins of the Permian world, with the Siberian trap still burning somewhere to the north, and the ocean still locked in its transformed chemistry, and the land still adjusting to a temperature and an ecological structure that bears almost no resemblance to what existed before, the survivors are simply continuing. They do not know they are survivors. They do not know there is anything remarkable about their continued existence. They know only what living things know. The immediate sensory world. The presence or absence of food and water and shelter, and the basic conditions that their biology requires to keep functioning. Lystrosaurus is still at the edge of some river, somewhere in what was once the southern supercontinent. The river looks different now than the rivers of the Permian. It runs differently, less stable, more variable, carrying more sediment than the rivers it replaced. The landscape around it is quieter than any landscape in the Permian ever was. The sounds of a world at full biological complexity are gone. What remains is something much less, in almost every measurable way, but it is something. and something, as it will turn out across the next tens of millions of years of Earth history, is enough. The question is no longer what killed the world. The world is dead, or close enough to dead that the distinction barely matters. The question now is, what is still breathing in the ruins, and why? When researchers examine the pattern of who survived the Great Dying and who did not, the picture that emerges is not a clean one. It is not the kind of story where a single factor explains everything, where one characteristic separates the living from the dead with the clarity of a line drawn in the rock. The Great Dying was not a test with one correct answer. It was a catastrophe that operated through multiple mechanisms simultaneously, across multiple environments, over an extended period of time. And the organisms that made it through did so for reasons that overlap and interact and resist reduction to a single principle. But patterns exist, and patterns, examined carefully and held with the appropriate uncertainty, are worth examining. The first pattern is one that shows up consistently across multiple groups and multiple environments when researchers compare the characteristics of survivors to the characteristics of victims. The survivors of the Great Dying, taken as a group, skew smaller than the victims. Not universally. There are exceptions. And there are groups where size does not seem to be the primary differentiating factor. But the tendency is clear enough across enough independent lines of evidence that it demands an explanation. And the explanation, when examined, makes sense in the specific context of what the Great Dying did to ecosystems. Large body size is generally advantageous in stable ecosystems. It provides protection from predation. It allows access to food resources that smaller animals cannot exploit. It enables the kind of competitive dominance that establishes and maintains ecological position across generations. The Gorgonopsids were large because large worked in the world that produced them, better than small. But large body size requires large amounts of food to sustain. A large animal has a large metabolic demand. It needs to eat more regularly, than a small animal in a stable ecosystem with a functioning food web. That demand can be met in an ecosystem that is losing its lower levels. That demand becomes a liability as the plant communities decline. The herbivores that feed on them decline. As the herbivores decline, the predators that feed on the herbivores face a shrinking food supply against an unchanged metabolic requirement. The small animals, needing less, have more options in a resource-depleted world. Not good options, not comfortable options, but more of them. The threshold between surviving and not surviving, in a world where food is scarce and getting scarcer, is lower for a small animal than for a large one. Lustrosaurus, the size of a pig, could find enough to eat in conditions where an animal the size of a rhinoceros could not. The second pattern is dietary flexibility. Organisms that had evolved to exploit specific food sources with high efficiency are among the most severely affected by the Great Dying. Their efficiency in normal conditions was built on specialization, on the refinement of their biology toward a particular ecological niche. That refinement is an asset when the niche is stable and reliable. It is a fatal dependency when the niche disappears. The organisms that survive at higher rates are the ones that can eat a wider range of things, not because they are better at any one thing, but because their adequacy across a range of things means that the disappearance of any single food source does not remove all their options. A generalist predator, in a world where prey diversity is collapsing, can shift to whatever prey remains. A specialist predator whose prey is gone has no equivalent option. The third pattern involves the ability to buffer against surface conditions. Some of the groups that make it through the Great Dying have a capability that provides, in effect, a partial escape from the worst of what is happening at the surface. The ability to burrow, to retreat underground during temperature peaks that the open air cannot sustain, to access food sources, roots, underground fungi, soil invertebrates that are somewhat buffered from the atmospheric and surface conditions affecting above-ground ecosystems. This is not a complete solution. The underground is not exempt from the effects of the crisis, but partial buffering, reducing exposure to peak stresses, even if it cannot eliminate exposure to average ones, may be the difference between a population that can maintain itself and one that cannot. These patterns are not a complete explanation. They are not a formula that, applied to any late Permian organism, would correctly predict its fate. Geography matters in ways that no trait analysis can fully account for. A population in the right location, with access to the right local refugia, may have survived for reasons that had nothing to do with any heritable characteristic, and everything to do with where it happened to be when the worst arrived. Chance is a real factor in extinction events of this magnitude, and the humility to acknowledge chance is part of any honest account of why the survivors survived. But the patterns point towards something real. They point toward the specific ways that the Great Dying filtered the biological diversity of the late Permian, not randomly, but through mechanisms that were selectively lethal to particular kinds of organisms and selectively survivable for others. And understanding those mechanisms, imperfectly and with appropriate uncertainty, is the closest we can get to answering the question that the silence poses. Lystrosaurus embodies most of the patterns, small enough that its food requirements could be met in a depleted world, a plant eater, not dependent on the complex predator-prey relationships that collapsed so completely during the crisis, capable of burrowing, providing access to the thermal buffering of the underground during temperature extremes, and equipped, according to the developmental evidence from fossilized specimens, with a reproductive strategy that could sustain populations even under conditions that were far from optimal. None of these characteristics, individually, guaranteed anything. Together, in the specific conditions of the Great Dying, they added up to enough, not to thrive, to persist, and persistence. In a world that was doing everything it could to make persistence impossible, was the most extraordinary thing any living thing could achieve. For a brief period in the earliest Triassic, after the silence, one animal appears everywhere. Its fossils turn up in South Africa, in Antarctica, in India, in Russia, in China. Wherever researchers examine early Triassic terrestrial deposits from the years and decades immediately following the boundary, they find Lystrosaurus, not in the rich, diverse assemblage of the Permian, where it was one animal among many in a world full of many, in a world where most of the many are gone. It is present in numbers and across a geographic range that have no real parallel in the vertebrate fossil record of any comparable period. Some estimates suggest that in the earliest Triassic, Lystrosaurus and its close relatives may have accounted for the majority of all individual large land vertebrates on Earth. Think about what that means, not as a data point about one species, as a statement about the state of the world, a single genus, or a small cluster of related genera, representing the majority of all large vertebrate animal life on an entire planet. The diversity that characterized the Permian, the dozens of synapsid lineages filling dozens of ecological roles across the full complexity of a functioning terrestrial ecosystem, reduced to something that can be summarized in a sentence. The world that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build its land, vertebrate fauna, into the complexity of the late Permian has been simplified. In the span of what is geologically an instant, to something that looks almost like a beginning. This is not a story of triumph. It is important to be clear about that. Lystrosaurus did not win the Great Dying. The concept of winning implies competition, implies being better than alternatives, implies some quality that outperformed what it was measured against, in a contest where the outcome was determined by excellence. What Lystrosaurus achieved is more specific and in some ways more interesting and more instructive than winning. It survived a filter that almost nothing else survived. And when the filter was finished, it found itself in a world where the ecological constraints that normally regulate any population, its competitors, its predators, the food web pressures that keep populations in check, had been largely removed. It expanded, not because it was exceptional, it expanded into an absence. The distinction matters because it changes what the story of Lystrosaurus after the Great Dying actually tells us. It is not a story about the superiority of a particular evolutionary strategy. It is a story about what happens when a world is emptied and something is left standing in it. The emptiness is not an opportunity in any normal sense of the word. It is a rhine, and the animal moving through it is not a conqueror. It is a survivor navigating the aftermath of something that killed almost everything it knew. The science of why Lystrosaurus specifically survived, rather than other dicynodont lineages or other synapsid groups that were present in the latest Permian, is not fully resolved. The patterns described in the previous chapter, small size, dietary flexibility, burrowing capability, reproductive resilience, all apply to Lystrosaurus in ways that are well documented in the fossil record. Fossilized bone histology, the microscopic structure of the bone tissue itself, suggests growth rates that were relatively rapid for an animal of its size and time, implying a metabolic and developmental strategy that could sustain population replacement even when conditions were poor. Fossilized eggs and juvenile specimens provide evidence of a reproductive approach that may have given Lystrosaurus populations an edge in rebuilding numbers after periods of acute stress. These are the scientific explanations. They are real, and they are supported by evidence, and they matter for understanding what the Great Dying selected for and why. But there is something else worth holding alongside the scientific explanations, something that the fossil record preserves in its own way. Not in the bone histology or the geochemical proxies, but in the simple, repeated, geographically distributed fact of presence. Lystrosaurus was there before. It was there after, across a boundary that eliminated the vast majority of complex life on this planet, across conditions that the world it lived in was not equipped to survive. It continued, day after day, in a landscape that was losing everything around it. It found enough. It moved when movement was required. It burrowed when the surface became too much. It ate what was available rather than what was preferred. It reproduced when reproduction was possible. It did not choose any of these things in the way that choice implies deliberation. It simply did them, because its biology was configured to do them, because the configuration that its lineage had arrived at through millions of years of evolution happened, without intending to be the configuration that the Great Dying did not eliminate. Lystrosaurus is not our ancestor in any direct lineage sense. It belongs to the dicynodont therapsids, a branch of the broader mammal line relatives whose own evolutionary journey ends without producing the group we belong to. Its lineage will persist into the Triassic, diversify briefly in the emptied world, and eventually decline as other groups recover, and the ecological complexity that the Great Dying destroyed begins, slowly and unevenly, to rebuild. The Dicynodonts will not be the ones who carry the thread forward to mammals. But it was here, on both sides, and what it represents, the specific, documentable, fossil record confirmed fact of a mammal line relative making it through the worst event in the history of complex life on this planet, is the most concrete evidence we have that the thread did not break. The thread was always going to be carried by something small, something flexible, something that did not require the world to remain what it had been in order to keep functioning. Lystrosaurus is the proof of concept, the demonstration, written in bone and preserved across 252 million years, that the combination of traits the cascade selected for was real, and that it worked, and that the world on the other side of the silence still had something in it that was alive. While Lystrosaurus moved through the emptied landscape of the early Triassic in its extraordinary, accidental abundance, another group was doing something quieter and, across the full length of what comes next, more consequential. The cynodonts. They are easy to overlook in the fossil record of the early Triassic, which is part of why they are often absent from popular accounts of the Great Dying and its aftermath. They are small. Most species in the earliest Triassic are comparable in size to modern rats or small dogs. Some smaller. They leave less robust fossils than larger animals. They do not dominate the assemblages the way Lystrosaurus does. They are present in the margins of a world that the bigger, more abundant survivor is occupying more visibly. But the cynodonts are mammal line relatives too, and they are carrying something that Lystrosaurus is not. The fossil evidence for cynodonts includes features that researchers have spent decades interpreting and debating. Features that represent early versions of what will eventually, across tens of millions of years of subsequent evolution, become the defining characteristics of mammals. The jaw structure of cynodonts is more complex than earlier synapsids, with bones that, in later mammal evolution, will migrate from the jaw to form part of the middle ear, enabling the sensitive hearing that is one of the distinctive mammalian traits. Some cynodont species show bone texture patterns that researchers have interpreted as consistent with metabolic rates higher than those of typical reptiles, suggesting a physiology moving in the direction of the endothermy that characterizes all living mammals. Certain features of the skull associated in living mammals with the placement of whiskers have been interpreted in some cynodont fossils as evidence of at least some facial hair. Though this remains an area of active research and debate, the cynodonts are not mammals. They are not even close to mammals in the way that a non-specialist would recognize the resemblance. They are older, stranger, less refined versions of the direction that the mammal lineage will eventually go. But they are on that lineage, and they made it through. They made it through for the reasons that the previous chapters have described. They were small. They were flexible in their diets, able to consume insects, small vertebrates, whatever protein the diminished world made available. Their possible metabolic flexibility, if the bone histology evidence is interpreted correctly, may have allowed them to remain active across a wider range of temperature conditions than strictly cold-blooded animals could manage. A significant advantage in a world where temperatures were doing things that cold-blooded physiologies were not built to handle. They did not make it through because they were destined to produce mammals. Destiny is not a concept that the fossil record supports. It offers evidence of traits and environments and the outcomes of their intersection. outcomes that were not predetermined and that could have resolved differently at many points. But they did make it through, and the lineage they carried forward did. Across tens of millions of years of subsequent evolution, eventually produce mammals. The path from the small, insect-eating cynodonts of the early Triassic to the first animals that meet the biological criteria for true mammals is not a straight line and not a short one. It runs through the full length of the Triassic period, through the ecological recovery from the Great Dying, through the eventual rise of the dinosaurs and the long period during which the earliest mammals existed in the margins of a world dominated by archosaurs. The mammals of the Triassic and Jurassic are small. They are nocturnal, almost certainly, using the cover of darkness to avoid the dinosaurs that dominate the daylight hours. They eat insects and small prey. They are, by any external assessment, minor components of ecosystems that are defined by much larger and more visually impressive animals. But they are there, and they are accumulating in their small, marginal, nocturnal way, the characteristics that will matter when the next great clearing comes. The sensitive hearing built from repurposed jawbones, the hair that insulates and enables endothermy across a range of environmental conditions, the enlarged brain regions associated with sensory processing and behavioral flexibility, the reproductive strategies that will eventually produce live birth and extended parental care, all of it developing slowly, across millions of years of evolution in the margins, in animals that look nothing like what they will become. The Great Dying did not create mammals. The causal chain is too long and too contingent for that framing to be accurate. But the Great Dying reshaped the evolutionary landscape in which the traits that cynodont survivors carried would eventually matter. It removed the ecological structures that had maintained the late Permian world in a configuration where those traits had no particular advantage. It cleared the board in ways that the subsequent history of life on this planet was built on, without intending to, without any direction or purpose, simply as the consequence of a geological process doing what geological processes do. The cynodont survivors of the Great Dying did not know what they were carrying forward. They knew the smell of insects and the temperature of burrows and the particular quality of darkness that meant it was safe to move. They knew what every living thing knows: the immediate, sensory, moment-to-moment information that survival requires. They did not know that the thread running through them connected a world that was mostly dead to a world that would, given enough time, be full again. But it did. And here, 252 million years later, measured in the unbroken chain of generations running from those small, marginal, nocturnal survivors to the present, is where the thread arrives. There is a river somewhere on Earth today. It does not matter which one, any river, on un continent, flowing through any landscape you can bring to mind. A river in a temperate forest, running clear over stones worn smooth by water, moving across them for longer than any human civilization has existed. A river in a tropical lowland, dark with tannins from the forest floor, moving slowly between banks, dense with vegetation. A river at the edge of a grassland, wide and shallow and full of the reflected light of an open sky. At the edge of that river, this morning, there are living things. Insects moving through the air above the surface. Their flight patterns, tracing the invisible geography of updrafts and food sources and the boundaries of territories measured in meters. Plants holding the bank in place with root systems that have been performing that function in the general biological sense since before the Permian world existed. Birds whose lineage runs back through the dinosaurs to the archosaurs of the Triassic and beyond. carrying in their bones the record of a history that the Great Dying was part of. Small mammals in the undergrowth, some of them moving in the early morning light, some of them retreating to the cover of roots and fallen wood as the day brightens, carrying in their metabolisms and their body plans and their behavioral repertoires, the accumulated inheritance of everything that survived, everything. This is an ordinary morning, the most ordinary thing there is. None of it was inevitable. Every complex living thing at the edge of that river is a descendant of something that made it through the Great Dying, not because it was the strongest or the most sophisticated or the most deserving or the most prepared, because a specific combination of traits and circumstances and, in some cases, the accident of geography, added up to enough in conditions that were configured, as completely as conditions can be configured without intention, to eliminate everything. The world those survivors inherited was not good. It was empty and simplified and ecologically impoverished in ways that took tens of millions of years to begin to recover from. The early Triassic Earth was not a triumph. It was a ruin that still had something living in it, something small and marginal and precarious and in no way guaranteed to produce anything beyond its own continued, difficult, uncertain presence in a world that had just demonstrated its willingness to eliminate almost everything. But something living in a ruin is not nothing. It is, as the 252 million years since the boundary have demonstrated, enough to rebuild from, given time, given the particular persistence of life, its tendency to find the available spaces and occupy them, its capacity to produce through the mechanism of variation and selection new forms suited to conditions that the previous forms could not have anticipated. Given the specific, unrepeatable history of one planet finding its way forward from the worst thing that has ever happened to complex life on its surface. There is no clean way to feel about the Great Dying. It resists the emotional categories that human beings reach for when trying to process events of large scale. It is too large for grief in any personal sense, too ancient for the kind of moral response that human catastrophes invite, too consequential in its downstream effects, to be simply mourned without acknowledging that the world it created, the world we are part of, would not exist in anything like its current form without it. What it leaves behind, for anyone who sits with it long enough to let the scale become real, is something quieter than grief and more durable than awe, something that comes from understanding that the ordinary morning outside your window is built on a foundation of survival so improbable, so repeatedly close to not occurring, that the only honest response to it is a kind of careful, sustained attention to what is here, because it almost was not. The Permian world did not know it was ending. The Gorgonopsids, refined by millions of years of selection into the most effective predators their lineage had ever produced, did not know that their perfection was about to become irrelevant. The trilobites, present in the ocean since before complex animals had eyes, did not know that their quarter-billion-year experiment was concluding. The reef systems, the brachiopod communities, the crinoid forests waving in the current of a sea that had supported them for longer than the human mind can intuitively grasp. None of it knew. And Lystrosaurus, at the edge of a river 252 million years ago, did not know what was coming, did not know what it was surviving, did not know that the specific, unremarkable fact of its continued existence, day after day, through conditions that were eliminating almost everything around it, would be preserved in rock and read by descendants of its distant relatives hundreds of millions of years later, and understood, finally, as one of the most important things that ever happened. It simply continued, found food when food existed, moved when conditions required movement, burrowed when the surface became too much, reproduced when reproduction was possible, persisted through days that grew harder in ways too large and too slow for any nervous system to register as crisis. In a world that was becoming day by ordinary day, something that no living thing in it had ever experienced before. And in persisting, without understanding, without intention, without any awareness of the significance of what it was doing, it kept something alive that the world would spend the next 252 million years building on. The river is still there, not the same river. The rivers of the early Triassic are gone, absorbed into the geological record, their courses long since redirected by the movements of continents and the erosion of the landscapes they ran through. But a river, the kind of river that exists because the world recovered, because the ruins of the early Triassic were inhabited by things that persisted in them, and those things reproduced, and their descendants adapted to the conditions of each successive world. And the complexity that the Great Dying destroyed was rebuilt, unevenly and imperfectly, and over timescales that dwarf everything in human history, into the world that contains the river you are thinking of right now. The thread that ran through the silence is still running. It runs through the insects above the water, and the plants along the bank, and the birds in the trees above, and the small mammals in the undergrowth, and everything else alive at the edge of that ordinary river on this ordinary morning. It runs through you. That is not a metaphor. It is biology. The unbroken chain of generations connecting the survivors of the worst event in the history of complex life to the present runs through every living thing on this planet, including the one encountering these words right now. You are, in the most literal sense that genetics allows, a descendant of something that made it through. The Great Dying almost ended the experiment of complex life on Earth. It did not. And the fact that there is something here, on this side of that boundary, capable of understanding what almost happened, is the most complete demonstration available of what making it through actually meant. Not an abstraction. This, right now, the sound of the thread, still holding,